This morning, we're going to start off with our third of 4 panels. This panel will look at sourcing new plant introductions from the wild to create ecological and naturalistic landscapes at home. Our panelists will discuss where they're finding new plants and how they're evaluating and preparing them for garden sale and use. They will also discuss their differing methods of propagation, particularly when it comes to growing mediums. Please welcome back to the stage Marina Christopher, Olivier Filippi, Peter Korn, and Cassian Schmidt with our moderator, Taylor Johnston. Thank you.
Okay, so to start, obviously you all travel extensively for your work, and I was wondering if you could just go down the line, maybe starting with you, Peter, and talk about what parts of the world you're most excited about traveling to and why?
To get the plant that works well in Sweden, I think Caucasus is one of the most important areas and very rich in flowers, but also Western America and Central Asia.
Nice. How about you?
Well, I've shown a little bit in my lecture yesterday. Kyrgyzstan was really amazing because this is a flora we don't know, and it's very suitable for our landscapes. It has the same level of precipitation, so these tall forb communities and also the dry part. So you have everything, and it is a little bit more familiar than maybe North America. It's totally different. And Asia is also very nice, this bold and subtropical look. Iran was amazing, wow. Actually. So there, and Middle Europe, we have so many pockets that are unknown in the Alps, in the Pyrenees. So you don't have to go really abroad to see amazing landscape and sources of ideas of landscape design. So it's around the corner sometimes.
Yeah. How about you, Marina?
Sadly, I haven't travelled that much, but in 1993 I went to Korea with Jamie Compton and John Cook and John Darcy, and we looked at a lot of woody plants. I was more interested in the herbaceous and also the wildlife, but that was a very interesting trip. I would like to spend more time in Mexico and the Mediterranean because I love that sort of flora, but my main travel actually has been in the UK with UK flora, but travel at the moment is limited because of home situations, but I would love to spend more time out and about. So I have to do a lot on the internet and listen to these wonderful people where they've been.
Yeah, we'll get to that a little bit. How about you?
We think about climate change, and we are looking for plants that are drought tolerant and wet tolerant and cold tolerant. So we try to go to places where we would have a chance to see and find some. So that's mainly in the mountains of the Mediterranean, but this could be, we will probably focus to Central Asia in the future. I think there are 2 main hotspots for us.
Very cool. So I'm hoping that you all can let us in on what it's like to source plants from the wild. Like, what does this look like? Do you take an entire plant? Do you take seeds, cuttings? How do you know what to take? And do you have to get permits? Who should be doing this? Probably not all of us, right? Anyone?
That's the most critical question, actually. And we get a little bit red about this question.
Yeah.
So far, there is quite many good seed hunters, so I'm a very good customer. So when I get a good seed list, I take away a few species and then I order the rest.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes I get a reply back that I sent the list, and then I have to reply that that's the order.
Okay.
Yeah. So supply the seed hunters and buy a lot of seed from them.
Interesting. How about you, Cassian?
Well, we have the advantage that we are also a proper botanic garden, so we have the source of 250 seed lists from botanical garden as a scientific exchange. This is one source, but the problem is that in botanic garden the plants are open pollinated, and I usually want to have seeds with a proper place name and where it comes from, elevation and so on, so to have ecotypes. So
Can you actually explain ecotype, what that means?
Ecotype means a special adapted plant or gene pool in a species. So like Panicum virgatum in North America, it has a really wide range, but they are adapted ecotypes like to sand dunes, to salty areas, to dry areas. They're very tall ones in Texas. So there are ecotypes adapted to a certain ecosystem. It's the same species botanically. And this is what I find very interesting, and this is what gardeners need, you know. If you see Panicum, Cloud 9, very tall from Texas, and this you think it's a different species, but botanical it's all the same. So this is for me interesting, different ecotypes, and then you have to have the source, and you know this seed source is from there, and this needs some traveling, and we can exchange things from. We have sometimes permits from botanical gardens or from, especially if they are restricted areas or nature reserves, usually somebody goes with you and you can pick some very small sources, or other botanical gardens have the permit and you get the seed source. But sometimes it's also very interesting to go into nature and see the variation, as we saw yesterday, you know, like Achillea filipendulina, usually it's that tall.
Right.
And you see, like in Kyrgyzstan, a very small one. And then I allow myself to take a little cutting, never a plant. And I'm not searching for rare plants. It's really from a visual point, is it useful for landscape architecture? And then sometimes I take a little cutting, not very much, usually seeds, but never in nature reserves, and not really rare plants or restricted or red list plants. I'm not really a collector. I see it from a landscaper's or landscape architect eye, what would be appropriate for future landscape, climate change, these things that drives me.
Yeah.
But usually you take the legal sources.
Hopefully, right.
Yes.
Yeah. Marina, if you're not traveling to do wild collection, how do you ensure that all of your propagules are responsibly sourced? Or do you have a specific?
Well, like Peter, I use a lot of seed catalogues and work online. If I'm doing plants for, say, a Chelsea that's from Jordan, I need to know what the flora is, and then I look online to see whether there's a seed company that's actually collected from the wild. And also, botanical gardens are a good source of seed, but as Cassian says, you do get hybrids and all sorts of problems with seed that is collected within a community of plants that all grown together. So wild collected seed for me is what I'm aiming for, and I think that's what you also, Peter, tend to go for. So people who are seed collectors, that's my main source.
Cool. Do you have any thoughts down there?
We tend to collect in the wild when we can, and this means that we have to answer questions, ethical questions about moving plants in the wild, about invasiveness, about what the perception of the cultural perception of what's good and bad, and we work a lot on that. I spend half my time at night reading papers on that and writing, and so it's a big issue for us. And sometimes we cheat. We're supposed to we can bring anything which is not protected inside Europe. With Brexit, it'll be a slightly different. But we go to Morocco and Turkey too, and we consider it's kind of Europe for us because we
A big Europe.
we think in geographical terms, in long-term history, not in history of man. So, of course, Australia is not in our zone, and there are main geographical barriers. But between Morocco and Spain, for historical reasons, it's not the same country, but it could be. And if it was the same country, no, in Spain and France. So there are restrictions and conservationists, and it comes from Barcelona, so you can't grow it in Montpellier. Oh, okay, for me, I might be mistaken, but for me that's rubbish. And which doesn't mean those thoughts in general are rubbish. So it's very difficult to go and not to fall in the extremes and to try to work in that kind of introduction production work to work intelligently. We try.
I would love to know if any of you have thoughts on the geopolitical landscape affecting how you collect wild plants in the near future, maybe longer term.
Didn't get the question.
How do you see, politics and kind of the landscape of ongoing, maybe political shuffles affecting your ability to collect in the wild or work with seed collectors?
Yes, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
Because it's getting more and more regulation, and it's getting more and more difficult to grow plants. And so
Do you find that it's easier cash in as an academic or botanical institution?
Well, it's even more restricted because as a botanical garden, you have these regulations, you have to keep record now of every source, and that's where it comes from, and this is for botanical garden really a problem because all these sources they had before, they sometimes don't know where they come from, and this Washington agreement and all these things you have to keep on, and it's for scientific botanical gardens really difficult now to keep all records, and it's not anymore that easy, and even this international seed exchange is almost illegal actually because there are seed sending all over the world, but to be realistic, it's a little bit illegal, but everybody does it, of course.
Right.
But all seeds exchange would be in the EU, to see it realistic, they are officially very restricted actually, and and I think it's a little bit also a time bomb for the future because you never know what fungus you get, and all these globalization, it affects us, and we see it, all these fungus what we had in the last years, like the Boxus survival and all these things, and I think in the future it will be pop up more and more and more. So
Definitely.
thinking about these, like Australia, they're very restrictive, New Zealand, because this flora is not adapted. So our flora is for centuries mixed up with anything, so we don't have this problem. But if you see it in North America, invasiveness and all these things, it's a big discussion now, and it's also political, because it's also a tendency to go native from an ideological point, which is a little bit scary now, to the right wing. This has also to do with plants, keeping away everything what's non-native. This is a separate discussion, but this also affects the whole thing, how we are dealing. Can you do prairie plantings in the future? Some people say, why do you go not native, and so this is also, it's a more political, ideological discussion. But on the other hand, you have the global climate change, and we are a woodland country. We had the ice age, and our source is very limited in Europe. We have only 40 woody species in Germany that are native, and most of them have diseases. You can't plant a beech as a city tree, and an oak, everything has something, the ashes, and so in the future we need sources from the Balkans, and so this is a little bit
and also, I'll join in. When you say you have 40 woody species which are native in Germany, what does it mean, native? It's a question of scale, of time and space. They were native since when? And the oaks, your British native oaks, they're nothing like native. They're just exotic invasive species which came in during the last
4,000 years.
Well, exactly, 5,000 years, but that's it. And now you have naturalization of the worst pest for you, which is our main key species, Quercus ilex, but maybe it's your future. Maybe we should have, but that's ideology, and it's very difficult to have, to think softly about ideology and landscape purpose.
And it's a matter of scale, and it's the political border. It's anyways nonsense. But this is the discussion. It doesn't make sense. You can use a plant from the high Alps because it's native. It's stupid, but you can't use a plant that's just grows over the border in Austria also, like the Pinus nigra.
Right.
It's on the list, you know, it's stupid.
And unfortunately, organizations of protection of nature have taken power on those themes, and scientists like Cation are silent. Well, he's not silent in his own word, but he's silent for the public, and you public are faced only with the same language all the time, and this language is not scientifically sound.
Nice.
Yeah.
In getting plants from the wild and bringing them into cultivation, how do you know how to propagate these plants? Are you worried about them becoming invasive? What are your first steps, Marina?
Basically, I sow them and then grow them on. Or I sow them and they don't germinate, and I wonder why. Try different things. There is one plant which grows all over Turkey and Israel, Artedia squamata. It's an annual, bit like Orlea. I can't germinate it. I don't know how to. I've tried every month of the year so far, still can't germinate it. So it's an enigma to me. I need to ask Peter what he would do. But first of all, I will germinate something and grow it on myself. Whether it's going to become invasive or not, I don't know. So I tend to grow it, give it to other people with a health warning. Very important to have a health warning with some of these plants.
Peter, do you find yourself doing similar protocols?
Yeah, and when you have grown a lot of plants, you get a feeling for them that some groups of plants might be invasive, and then you check them carefully to see what they're doing. And if they are too bad, they end up on the lawn.
Yeah.
The lawn is a perfect compost and kills everything.
Yes. Okay. Do you
And I'm a gardener. I don't want weedy plants in the garden, and I wouldn't use them for landscaping. So.
Okay.
But then you never know. You use them in another setting, and it might be invasive there. So you have to think if there is a risk for it.
So are trials an important part of this whole process
Yeah.
for you? Okay.
Yes. I mean, a plant that might be very well behaved in clay because it stays still, in a light sandy soil, might run everywhere. And again, plants like Potentilla recta sulfurea, it's all over Corsica, it's all over Australia. If you go down the roads, it's been taken by the wind from the cars. But it's a weed there. Here it's not so bad. So you do need to know what escapees might do in the environment.
Great.
Difficult to predict, actually.
Yeah.
It
so
is.
there's a rule of about one introduction from 1,000 introductions will be invasive. So we have about 50,000 plants, a source of plants. So it's not that many, actually, but it can take years, and it comes from the composition from the plant, the climate, global climate change can shift it totally, and plants can be, like in the Balkans, can be invasive, here not yet. So it's difficult to predict, and we usually grow them in the nursery, and I make raised beds and look how they perform, and especially North American plants with a lot of seed production, like Solidagus, Asters, we have to be very careful. But there's one trick. Usually the Asteraceae, especially the North Americans, are self-sterile. So if you use a clone, this is a to use clones, also from an aesthetic standpoint, you have a certain height and color, so clones are not totally bad, and especially for invasiveness, if you use clones, and this is why some nursery plants are very well behaved, like Solidago. Many Solidagos are self-sterile, unless you use only one clone, actually. So this might be eupatoriums and so on. They rarely set seeds. So this might be one option to deal with this. Not always, but...
you don't always know in advance.
Yeah. So, but it's a discussion. There are books in Germany about this, but it's globalization. So plants are shifting, and we have these brownfields, and this is mainly neophytes. But these plants are adapted to these sites. Obviously, our native plants are not adapted to these extreme sites. So this is also a sign of of course, and human beings are also kind of part of the ecosystem, actually. So you have to accept it in one way. Yeah.
Yeah, to that point,
Yeah.
actually. Oh, please.
I was going to say, do you, Oliver, find that some of our species have become invasive in your Mediterranean cushions?
No, but the opposite. I would say some of our native species of the Mediterranean will become invasive, for
The
whatever
annuals
that means,
especially.
in the northern part of Europe. But that's just shifting. And I wanted to. I'm sorry, I'm not exactly answering your question, but never mind. I wanted to jump in about invasiveness. We all often speak of a species which is an invasive, but it's a mistake. It's never a species. It's a population of a species linked to a habitat and often linked to disturbance. So you have 3 parameters, and you have to study them calmly. Populations, habitats, disturbance. And what comes first? Is it invasiveness that creates disturbance? Often you think so, but it's the opposite way around. It's just disturbance that, like a vacuum cleaner, it takes any pioneer plant, be it native or exotic. And then, because we don't like the exotics, we say, oh, it's invasive.
Ground elder, brought in as a food plant. I mean, who doesn't know about ground elder in Britain?
Right. So with
Yeah,
drastic...
there is also a lot of native plants that is very invasive.
That's a good point.
So if
Yeah,
you drive
pioneer
along the road,
plants.
there is a lot more epilobiums growing in the ditches
Tons.
than there is invasive plants.
That's right.
So the local plant can be really invasive in disturbed areas.
Correct.
And they
And
are
yes-
a bigger problem. Than
And yesterday, Keith was talking about his friend who sold the piece of land because of Equisetum and convolvulus. A good
Yeah.
point about native invasiveness.
Yeah.
Right. So with drastic, unpredictable climate change now our new normal, do you feel that wild plants are perhaps better adapted for garden settings, or do you think hybrid vigor is something we should be exploring for future gardens?
It's a general belief, but I think it's not true.
Interesting.
Wild plants are better adapted than hybrids. Sometimes it can be really the opposite,
yeah.
because of the hybrid effect. Plants are the hybrid vigor, so hybrids can be more vigorous, or they can have certain traits that are better adapted. So I wouldn't certainly say that's better or not. We in Germany have this discussion now, or we have the laws actually to, especially with city trees, to use autochthone material. So this is adapted to a certain region. It's not really scientifically researched now, but we have 8 regions. So if you use a linden tree or something, or a capinus,
Okay.
it has to be from a certain region, the gene pool from a certain region.
Right.
But the problem is, everything is forested. It's not native flora, so it's always a difficult thing. And also with perennials, if you do it outside the city for nature conservancy or long road trips, it has to be a source from a certain region. So certified seed sources, and they grow them from certain plants. And it's a discussion if these plants are better adapted than other plants. For me, sometimes it doesn't make sense, because otherwise, if you use plants from other sources and they grow better, they seem to be better adapted than the original ones. So because climate changes, and so it's really a discussion if this makes sense for the future. Because these like trees are adapted to the region for hundreds, thousands of years, but now it's shifting. So,
And
it's
you have
and
to
the conditions we are creating is not nature. So
yeah. Anyway,
you can't just copy the nature and bring in plant in locally, because
And we have
our climate is so different.
We have the same problem in France about this nativist approach of gene pools for nature conservation, and especially about trees. It's just nonsense, because you just forget that the genes move and the pollen moves with the wind and the clouds. And when you have in France a very big storm coming from the south, the windshields are red with the sand of the Sahara, and in the sand of the Sahara you have you have pollen. And for the oaks, the pollen oaks, it has been studied
And
in
fungus,
the US.
they discovered it now that all the fungus from the Sahara come to Germany.
The,
and
Kill all the
the
trees.
fungus, everything moves. So sticking to your own gene pool in a couple of kilometers of scale is just nonsense. It's nice for you, but for nature it doesn't change anything.
A great point. Marina, you mentioned that it could take many years, if ever, to propagate a plant that is wild collected. Can you all think about plants that you would love to have that either no one has found propagules for or that you've just never successfully brought into cultivation?
Loads.
Yeah, a very large number.
Yes. Can you give an example, Peter?
There's so many. Yeah.
Okay.
There's so many.
Fair enough. How about you, Cashin? Is there anything that you would love to see in gardens that haven't quite been able to crack the code on?
Well, if you travel in nature, you see so many things that would be that would have a great potential for landscape design. From this point, I don't know if they are growable or not. You know, if you go to the woodlands of China, you are amazed about these textures and all these things, and lone rubus. And so I think in every country, in Kyrgyzstan, there's so many plants
Every
that are
stop.
untrialed actually, and beautiful plants. And maybe in the future we will see them. And but sometimes for me it's always also nice to see plants I know already growing in the nature. So this is also this aha effect.
Sure.
You know, this is for me at least as important as to see new plants.
If plants are really difficult to grow, then from a gardener's point of view, is it really worth it when there is such a large variety of plants that you can grow well? I mean, from the nursery point of view, it's always a challenge to grow things that are difficult. But if they're difficult, there's probably a reason why they're difficult. They need very specific conditions. And so, yes, it's a challenge for us, but are they good garden plants? Not necessarily.
It's a really good point.
And I would like to try to follow up a discussion I was having this morning with Bob Page, who was the former NCPG Cistus collection holder. And his point was that we already have in collections in Europe many, many beautiful plants, but there's a gap between collection and availability for the landscape designers. And this gap goes through trade, and there's a problem. It's not good enough for money, or it's easier to have a narrow range and to do cheap stuff, and all those new plants might be expensive to grow, and sometimes they're really good, but they're not available in the specialist nurseries. So there's a gap problem, and you in the UK, maybe even more so, before in the past, you had beautiful collections which were considered only as collection items, and now they can be considered as source for landscaping to resolve problems.
But it's also important for designers to ordering plants that don't exist yet, because every nursery wants to make money, so if you start ordering them, someone will grow them.
Thank
So
you. Yeah, that's a
So
really
because
good
the nurseries
point.
can't have a selection of everything. Because we know that we have nurseries with plants that no one buys,
Yeah.
because people don't know them. And after a while, you stop growing all these plants that you can't sell, and you keep them yourself. So you just have to start asking for plants that are suitable, and then someone will propagate them.
That's a great point. I don't know if you find this where you are, but in the US, specialty nurseries seem to be closing quite a bit.
Yeah.
It's very easy to make work with plants, but not a living. So aside from maybe better research, can you think of how designers or other players might be able to support this kind of work?
Well, we grow a lot on contract for special design jobs. So that's one good way. And the other good way is communication. This is why I take away my shoes and all that stuff. It's about communication. So people understand some unknown plants might be really useful, and then they ask for it, and then all of you grow them.
Do you find that it's difficult as plants people to talk to non-plant people? Is there a communication barrier, if you will? How do you overcome that?
I think you need to be able to communicate in a way that is understandable. I think if you're using a lot of jargon, it makes it very difficult for people to understand. And I think that quite often it's quite nerve-wracking because all of us internationally speak in botanical language. So if I'm talking about an artemisia, all of you will know. But if I'm talking about a mugwort, maybe you won't. But the general public, I find, they have difficulty with some of the naming. So you need to be able to communicate to the people. And I know that quite often, because I work in botanical kind of nomenclature, it can put people off. And so when you see a blank face, you then need to start not dumbing down, that's not what I'm meaning, but being able to communicate to the person. And if you can get them excited and interested, then you can move on. And I think communication, I think you're brilliant at communication. And being able to talk to your customers and get them excited. And taking your shoes off is a great way.
And it was only the shoes this time.
I know.
And about communication, in fact, we have the passion and the knowledge and the plants, or we think we do, and we forget the people which are in front. So the best is to do like a sociological approach and to think, what is the person in front of me waiting? What is, as a gardener, his needs now, his problems? And then you speak in the terms of resolving a problem, and you don't speak anymore of botanical collection if it's too difficult, but only of technical solutions. And in fact, you have a wide botanical range that comes as just at the right time, the right technical solution for a problem or several problems.
Do you think that the garden media has a responsibility to better describe the work that you're doing or perhaps make it more mainstream?
The garden media is a big problem because they are just all these fancy pictures and everything is so simplified and it's just for the no knowledge people.
I like
really
garden
need
media.
to make it more advanced, but still simple for everybody to understand it.
I like garden media as when they'll do black and white pictures.
I think it's quite important to show that not everything works. I mean, gardening is about a series of mistakes and trying to improve on things. And the garden media tend to show all these amazing places which we can only aspire to, whereas all of us nurserymen know that for lots of things where we've got, you know, a graveyard of labels of plants that we've killed. I certainly have a very large graveyard, but then I move on and grow other things that I'm more successful with. So yes, the garden media, I think, does move things towards perfection, and there's very little perfection, I think, in general, in most people's gardens. There's always room for improvement.
And also the garden media tends to create fashions because there's some money behind, and sometimes it's fake. It's a wrong direction, and all those. What did you say, James, yesterday? Yeah, the bubble. Yeah, and the terms. What do you call it? Natural plantations? No, it's not your term.
Naturalistic?
Naturalistic. So people think it's natural. No, it's fighting against nature because you can't maintain it. And so garden media makes all the mistakes bigger, and you take them in the face.
Yeah.
I don't want to call it mainstream, actually. We are avant-garde because we are pushing things forward, and so we are a cult, actually. This is the problem, actually, but you know, I think we shouldn't really please the mainstream thing. Maybe it's wrong, and but I think if you please the mainstream, you don't evolve the things further, and it's my opinion. And if you always please the public, you know, there is no evolution in design and everything, and you always use the same plants what they publish, so it's you know, it doesn't go forward, actually.
Sure. And to that point, I think one of the misconceptions about a lot of this work is that you really only work with herbaceous plants, mostly perennial plants. Can you all talk a little bit about how you're using woody plants or thinking about introducing wild woody plants?
I'm not that. I like the wind and the sun, so I avoid the trees as much as possible.
No shrubs?
No, some scrubs, but
Okay.
not too many.
Okay.
I think because so many gardens now are so small, one has to be very careful about using really large woody trees that are going to get very big. So shrubs and small trees, I think, are more important for most gardens from the practical point of view. Whereas large estates obviously can grow some fantastic woody plants. But I tend to work with herbaceous and shrubs and small trees because most gardens don't have room for, you know, a mighty oak or something, but a small tree might work with some shrubs. But again, like Peter, I'm more into my sunny, well-drained plants, so I want as much sun as possible. But a little bit of shade, especially in a summer like this, is really quite useful.
Yeah, you can make a pergola.
Oh yes,
I
glass of wine.
disagree. No, from a designer's point, woodies are essential actually to build space. You can do it with bold perennials, but you know, to create habitats, you need woodies actually to have a shady habitat. Of course, you can have a pergola, but I think woodies are important. And from my point, I started with woody plants actually because they are more impressive and they have more structure in the winter. So I think, and also from the standpoint of the city climate, woodies are very important. You know, the herbaceous stuff is a nice to have extra, but what really is important, what really matters is the woody trees and the alleys and all these things in a larger scale actually. And also, if you see Beth Chatto's garden yesterday, you know, imagine without trees, without these focus points and so on, and I think it's very important. And also now we have, you know, smaller gardens is a solution, of course, and there are many sub-shrubs, you know, from the Mediterranean you could use, and smaller things, or dwarf selections of plants or medium-sized trees, the slow-growing trees. And so there are many solutions, I guess, also for smaller gardens. But to build up spaces, it's necessary, really. And the new approach is, which comes actually from England, from Nigel Dunnett, and James has done it, this so-called coppicing, you know, the new invention of the mixed border. So to cut down the trees, to evoke a big foliage and a nice coloration of foliage, to cut down the woodies and treat them as perennials actually. So this is a new thing maybe on a small space to use woody plants.
Do you have any thoughts on woody plants?
Well, for us, a woody plant is this high plant because it's a sub-shrub, and of course
I like them too.
And we're interested more in evergreen plants than in deciduous perennials, because the deciduous perennial, if it's deciduous for you in winter, for us it's deciduous too in summer, so it doesn't leave much. And the structure of the garden in difficult conditions has to be evergreen for us. Perennials popping up, but very few in fact. And yeah, I love the idea of coppicing the trees or the subshrubs, or for us in the Mediterranean, the arbutus, a lovely arbutus coming back. And this is seldom used in landscaping. I'm sorry because I forgot to quote yesterday one name, James Basin. He's doing a lovely job in the south of France and elsewhere with new ideas, just thinking a very intelligent insight on Mediterranean ecosystems and trying to transfer this to gardens. And he does things like that, coppicing arbutus or thinking about a future virtual hedge, and he just plants poles and a line between the poles, waiting for the birds to come and the droppings to create the hedge, and all that. That's really stages of evolution in the garden. And he sells that as not a fixed design garden, but as transient stages. Very nice.
Beautiful. I wonder if you all experiment with the biomechanical mechanisms. Oliver, you talked a little bit about allelopathy. Maybe you might be able to expand on that a little bit. We don't have a ton of time, but are you thinking about this in a nursery setting or in your work outside of the nursery?
Yeah, some plants they just want to grow themselves, and probably they're killing plants around them. I haven't thought that much about it, but I know some plants just want to be alone, and then I use them as that. You can't mix them.
Yeah.
I mean, many of these plants that have allelopathic properties are useful in, basically used in the medical trade, and were known about many, many years ago by herbalists and people working with healing people. And a lot of these allelopathic properties, the chemicals, are being used now. For instance, Salvia leucophila has these properties, and it's got terpenes in it and diterpenoids, and they're being used for cancer treatments. So I think I don't use it necessarily in a garden situation, but I'm very aware that some of these chemicals are probably extremely important for future research in cancer.
Wow, interesting.
So I don't know whether you've come across this with your other salvias, like the salvia you mentioned yesterday.
Well, yeah, there's a direct link between chemicals and allelopathy, but not only allelopathy, and traditional medical uses for all those rosemary and salvias and all those collections. They're really interesting. The first thing for us in a nursery, we're in an organic nursery, and allelopathy is welcome. We weed less, so that's good for us. And then we work on all the interactions. For us, the quality of a plant for us to be sold is through the root system. And so we use forestry pots, anti-spin system and all that, and a special soil mixture. And we, thanks to not using any fungicide, we work on mycorrhiza in the pot. Mycorrhiza and bacteria symbiosis. So the plant has more chance to find it easier when going to the garden.
That's fascinating. Are you all concerned a bit about plants transferring from the nursery setting? Maybe for you this is different, trial beds into the final planting, and how are you adapting your practices to think about that?
Yeah, we grow all our own plants just in pure sand, and then it's easy to move them to anything else. Before I had them in quite good soil in the pots, and then they were always suffering when I put them in harsh conditions.
Wow.
So it's much easier to grow them hard in the nursery, and then you can move them to anything else. And they are so happy to get out.
How about you, Cashin?
Well, we use a potting soil. It's an organic potting soil, but not with peat moss. It's just from shredded bark and so on. So very organic, but we use not organic fertilizer, so a slow release fertilizer usually makes it easier. And in normal soil, there's no problem actually. If you use small pots, big pots, this is the problem, what you sell in the garden centers. So I would use small pots actually, or even plugs. It's even better, or deep plugs. It's even better, like they use it in North America. I think this is very, very good. And they have also plugs that have side
internal ribs.
Yes.
Yeah, so that they're down
roots
the
go down.
root bounds. So this is very important, I think. So the root system, that it's straight and not overgrown, like 2-3 years. I think this is important. That is really vital. And there was trials in Germany about, shaking off all the material or not planting in mineral soil. And actually, there was no difference scientifically. I don't know if it's only a belief, but there was, in the end, there was not much different actually if you start with small pots.
When I
I
plant
think,
them in with pure sand beds,
Yeah, this
then I
is,
think. But if I plant them in a normal soil, I don't take it
well, it
away.
was a very mineralic soil, but not pure sand,
No,
actually.
when you put it in pure sand.
But
it's-
they did this trial,
Yeah.
and in the end, there was not more loss or less loss of plants, and no more or less vigor. And even the beginning was a less vigor, of course.
Yeah.
I think the main
But in the end, it was the same.
Wow.
I think the main problem is for the customer. If a designer, for instance, is going to a garden and using plugs because plugs are growing strongly, and they put in a few plugs, a customer will look and say, well, what's that? And I think that's why a lot of garden centres and a lot of wholesale nurseries grow bigger and fleshier, because the customer will see that planting and say, oh, now that's a garden. But these little plugs,
Yeah,
it's
if
not
you
a
sell
garden.
plugs, you sell hope, you know. They'll think, oh,
Yeah, but hope, it's got to be the education of the customer. And
right.
they
right.
don't realise
But
that,
customers want
you
to
know,
have it instant. You know,
Exactly.
this is the problem.
But a lot of big plants go backwards once planted in the garden, whereas plugs will go forward. But can you get that knowledge to the customer? I know that a lot of designers would prefer to, I mean, it's much easier to plant something that big than that big, but that's not what the customer's seeing. They're just seeing little tiny plants. And I think that's the real problem with planting and the vision that a customer has. I mean, we all know that smaller plants establish better, but tell that to a customer.
Yeah, just to wrap things up, because sadly we're out of time. Do you think that the work that you're doing is best suited to specific types of projects? Peter, you mentioned some of your public works. We heard from Cashin about his island medium. Do you think that there's a broad range of appeal maybe in private gardens, or is this pretty specific?
In private garden, it's normally a small space, and they have time to water and weed and everything. So, in the traditional way, it's fine. So it's more in the new projects.
How about you, Marina? Do you feel like your plants are going off, other than Chelsea, to specific kinds of projects?
I think people who know the nurserymen and know the specialists will come, but it's a very niche market, very small, and I mean, from financial terms, it's not particularly well. It's not particularly good. I'm never going to be a millionaire, put it that way.
Yeah.
But you know, it's a niche market, and I think that, like you say, with specialty nurseries going in the USA, a lot are going in Britain because they just can't make ends meet. I think that would be a huge disappointment, because the range of plants will just get smaller and smaller. So you need to support small nurseries, small specialist nurseries.
It's a great note to end on. Thank you.
And I think actually the designers depend on these nurseries, because you are discovering these unknown things, and you know, they feature them maybe in Chelsea and so on, and immediately a plant pops up as fashionable, you know.
Yeah.
I gave my first piece of the Celleria autumnalis to Pete, and it grows 35 years in Hammond, so a patch, very old. Nobody knew it, and so Pete put it to a propagation nursery, and now it's an iconic feature plant of his plantings. So, and everybody wants it, but 10 years ago, nobody knew it. So all these hidden treasures, you know, this comes from your nurseries, and so we depend on these nurseries, and we come to England to search for these things, and if you use them then in a design, then these plants get fashionable, but then you have to think new, because
Always.
unless it's fashionable, you're bored to see it everywhere.
Thank you all
But
so
the problem
much.
is that people go to the big nurseries to buy the big numbers of plants, and then they come to you and just buy the specialities. And that's really hard to make a living of just selling them. You need to sell all the plants to make
Yes.
money.
Yeah, this is a problem, that usually you have contract nurseries, they grow the big numbers,
Yeah.
and you are the providers for the single plant. This is
Yes.
the problem.
It is.
Great. Thank you all so much for your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marina, Olivier, Peter, Cashin, and Taylor.